Good?
Yeah.
Okay, let's turn it off now. Okay. This is an oral history with Shirley Garcia, the second oral history. And we're meeting on November 14th, 2003 at Shirley's home. And this is an oral history for the Maria Rogers Oral History Project at the Carnegie Library and also for the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum. Thank you very much again, Shirley, for agreeing to meet for this. And, you know, we were talking a little bit after the, about your last oral history, and I was saying that I didn't quite understand how you made the transition from working as a chemical operator to working in environmental waste management. So would you mind starting with that?
Sure. Back at that time at Rocky Flats, all employees, whether they were hourly or salary, had the benefit of education, furthering their education. And at that time, they paid 100% of your tuition and your books. And I did not finish college. I went to college right after high school, got married, decided who needs an education, and always wanted to do that. So what I did is I decided to go back to school in fall of '88. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I decided to go back to Front Range Community College, which is right across the street. And I went back in the fall, and that spring they had this funny sign up, but it was a RAD sign, which I right away recognized. And it was
RAD.
A radioactive sign, a radiation sign. That plus some hazardous waste signs caught my attention, and it was for hazardous waste management. And at the time at the site, being hourly, I worked with waste. We moved drums around all the time. I said that sounded really interesting, something I would like to do. And that's how I got involved with that program. So I was going to school, got involved with that, and at the time, that was at the time where they had got sued at Rocky Flats, where they had to fall under the Resource Conservation Act for all the RCRA waste. Because up until that time, they said they were exempted because of the RAD part of it. So I was in non-destructive assay, which is NDA, and we were the first group that actually had to put the hazardous waste label on the drums. We weren't doing it right at the time. There wasn't a program really in place. So we were able to do that, and at that time I knew it clicked. I knew what I always wanted to do. I loved working with waste, and went back to school at Front Range and got my associates there. And I had moved out to the solar ponds, and I think in my last interview I told you I was actually working out there when we got raided. We were outside, so that was really a unique situation to see everything happening. Whereas most people were in the buildings, they weren't aware of what was happening until the FBI actually came into their buildings. Yes. So I believe it was in July of 1989, they posted the first jobs for the first hazardous waste coordinators at Rocky Flats. I applied for the job, luckily because of what I was taking at school. So I was one of the first 3 hazardous waste coordinators. And went to school there, went on to Metro, and luckily again at the time, which was really interesting, by then EG&G had come into place out there and managed it. They actually brought classes on site. So if you wanted to go to school, University of Denver and School of Mines were offering classes at Building 060. So it was perfect. Right when you got off work, you could go to class, do your class, and then come home. So I did that, and so when I was going to Metro at the same time, I was working towards a certificate at the University of Denver. I was trying to work on both of them at the same time, so when I got my undergrad degree at Metro, I still had credits towards DU to apply towards my master's.
So you could take
So I was able to take both. So as soon as I graduated from Metro, I applied the classes I had taken to DU for the certificate for waste management. I had taken that and applied those credits towards my master's degree. So I was able to finish that in about a little under a year and a half. So I was going to school, I just happened to be working my way up through management. I've always loved it. We worked on the first Part A interim status permit. We had to do that, and it was like the...
Can you describe a little bit of what that was?
It was like the blind really leading the blind. We were given the regulations and told, you know, you need to write this section, you need to write that section. And luckily, because I had a lot of really good instructors that worked for the state at the time, so I was able to go to them and they were helping me lead the way. And we had a really good program. We had a lot of people out there that were just winging it. We worked really good as a team, and the Part A permit was interim status, which led to the Part B permit that they have now as a permitted facility.
Now, you probably had to learn a lot about the legal requirements as well as about the science of it. I mean, what aspects of waste that were required control and that sort of thing.
And one of the things that helped me that was really unique is since I had worked in different buildings, I could say, yes, I remember this building, this room, this is what process was being run, and these are the chemicals that were used, which help us characterize the waste under RCRA. And when I actually became a coordinator and started managing waste for the coal side, which is the 800 buildings, I didn't know anything about that because up until that point, before we got rated, you didn't know what other buildings did. You basically knew what building you worked in because of the secrecy of it. And especially the coal side didn't know what the hot side, which are the plutonium buildings, did, and vice versa. So when I started going to those buildings on the coal side, that's how I learned a lot about the processes, because they were still operating to an extent, to see what constituents were being used. So I really had that as an advantage, because if I needed to characterize stuff, I can go back and say, I remember they did this, and this is what Freon was used, or trike was used, et cetera, things like that, or beryllium. So that helped me out a lot. Like I said, I stood there till 1997, and I had...
You were in the same position as the...
No, as a hazardous waste coordinator, I was that. I was offered a job in the compliance side of the house. I took that, and I think in my last interview, I said I really didn't like it because it was a job where you always were going in and you were writing up people for what they did wrong. Instead of, I would have preferred send me to that building, let me help them fix what's wrong and train them. So that turned out perfect. I didn't like that job as much, and my old boss wanted me back, so she created a position as a training manager. I knew nothing about training, so I was offered a job. I went back as a training manager, and we drafted a lot of the original procedures. Drafted procedures for the sewage treatment plant, drafted some of the first procedures for the present landfill to make sure they weren't receiving any hazardous waste. We actually had waste technicians that were hourly people that worked for me that literally had to go stand out there and watch the waste as it was being dumped off the trucks to make sure there weren't any hazardous waste that inadvertently ended up in the waste. That was pretty hard on them because it's not a fun job, and it's not very safe to go walking through trash with broken glass, et cetera, things like that. So that only lasted, I think, for about 5 or 6 months. It became more of a safety hazard thing. So eventually they ended up locking the dumpsters on site to make sure no one threw anything away there that they shouldn't have. So I just continually moved up the ranks, and then when RMRS came in, I was offered a job as a lead over waste management areas, 90-day areas, and some of the RCRA permitted units. And then naturally they were always reorganizing, so every time they would reorganize, I would get additional work scope. And in '97, I got a job from someone in Grand Junction who wanted to know if I'd go work for them and be their environmental compliance person. And I knew Rocky Flats was going to be coming to an end. I just didn't realize how soon. I just knew that at my age, I was too young to retire, but I needed to find a job, so that was perfect. It was exactly what I wanted to do. It was still dealing with waste and compliance and remediation, which I didn't know anything about. To me, it was a challenge, so we moved to Grand Junction. But since I had grown children and grandchildren, 4 hours away was still just too hard for us to be away from our family, so we just moved back. And when we did move back, it was really hard to find work because this area is so saturated with environmental people, professionals. And I tried to get back on a couple of times for Rocky Flats, but with the budget and stuff like that, it didn't come to fruition. But it turned out perfect for me because I ended up getting hired by the city of Broomfield at the time before it became a county. And during my interview, it was very interesting because they had asked me if I would mind working on Rocky Flats issues, and I told them I have no problem with it. But my first reaction is, well, how much time am I going to be spending on Rocky Flats? You know, I had moved away from Rocky Flats. And it wasn't that I had any animosity against it. I just wanted to move on and stick in my little world of waste. And I think Kathy originally said it would only be around 20% of my time, but turned out it's basically the majority of my time. But I find it very interesting. And as we had discussed, it's a different perspective, being on the inside versus being on the outside.
Right, and I'd like to get to that. But before we leave your earlier years in Rocky Flats, I wanted to ask you what it was like to work there with your husband and also be raising your children here.
That was very hard, raising children working at Rocky Flats, because children always want to know what their parents do. And to have both parents that work out there and not be allowed to talk about it. We had to be, even when you go out to dinner, simple things where you talk about how your work day is, that's something that you really couldn't talk about out in the open. You were afraid people were going to overhear. Sure, I could talk to my husband, this is what happened. A lot of times we worked in the same building, but children always wanted to know. They always had things at school where they would go and say, my mom does this, my dad does this, and all they could say is, well, my mom and dad, they just knew it as a production plant. They didn't know basically what we made. So to them, it was their parents worked at a factory. And that's it. At their level, I remember telling my daughter, just tell me that your mom and dad work at a factory and it's here in town. And that was, they never really did ask. It wasn't until they were older, and we had briefly talked about, it was really hard at a time because a lot of people resented Rocky Flats. During that time, there was a lot of resentment with peace, and it was hard on them too, because when they asked where their parents worked, sometimes it was embarrassing to say my parents worked at Rocky Flats. Because a lot of times when people would even ask me sometimes, because you didn't know how people would react. It was a very negative thing sometimes to say you worked at Rocky Flats. So they went through a transition. Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. So it was a hard transition. When they were younger, it was a factory. When they were older, when it was not politically correct to have someone working at Rocky Flats, they really didn't get into it. They would either change the subject or whatever, but eventually some of their close friends knew, because after a while, even the house that we live in now, there's a lot of people in this neighborhood that worked at Rocky Flats. So it was almost like a little group, a little clique of people that knew. And my son in particular, his two best friends in high school had parents that worked at Rocky Flats, so they had something in common. And that was just really unique. We didn't talk too much about what we did at work, and my husband being a monitor before he went salary, and me being an operator, we had a lot in common, but we didn't talk too much about how our days were or what had happened.
And I would imagine that was partly because even the parts that you could share that had nothing to do with national security, there's an atmosphere that you just don't talk about it. And we'd always, from national security all along, we were always told, be careful what you say on the phone, your phone could be bugged. So there was always that atmosphere, that environment, that you had to be really, real careful because of national security. And it was something that wasn't really imposed upon you, but it was more of a respect for, this is the job and this is part of the responsibility I have that goes along with this job, to maintain this, so that I have to ensure that I am maintaining national security. Because we always would take training classes on security. You don't know who can be listening or who can be tapping your phone, et cetera, things like that. We didn't know to the extent of how true it was, but we just knew that's what we were being told. Yeah.
So that's why we didn't even talk about it too much at home.
And when your children were grown up, have they ever talked to you about being curious about what you did, or have you?
Yes, and now I think what was really interesting is even when we worked out there, we found out a lot more information through the newspaper than we did even working out there. We would read something in the paper about something that had happened in other buildings that we weren't even told. But after '89, and after I think everything opened up and Jesse came out, Roberson, to the site, and things weren't as secretive, they know now what we did basically. I've told them basically what it's like for a glove box. As a matter of fact, I think it was in Arvada or someplace, someone had a glove box in their backyard, and we drove by and I got all excited and I told my kids, look, that's a glove box. That's what Mama used to work in. And they understand, and they know more or less what we did, what my husband used to do as a RCTA monitor. And waste. My son even got into waste. It was just something that I guess is in our family. But they know pretty much. I think everyone basically does know what happened at Rocky Flats now, especially after 1989. That veil was lifted, and everyone was aware of what happened.
Did you feel good about that in terms of, the roles that you've had since then, the lifting of the secrecy?
Yes, because it was a job we took pride in. And for it to be so negatively, the way we were treated sometimes because we were working at Rocky Flats. And a lot of people would always say, even now you can still hear people saying, you were paying good because you got paid good because you took the risk, and you personally took it upon yourself to take that risk. And I don't think it was necessarily a risk, it was a pride thing. And I tell that, and you can talk to any, and I call them the old timers. To me, you can tell old timers, because old timers don't refer to Rocky Flats as Rocky. They normally call it the Flats. And you hear the new people and they refer to it as Rocky. So a lot of times when I go to presentations or meetings and you can hear people saying, well, I've been out there for 15 years, and they say Rocky, that's telling me they weren't there during the production years. And there's a big difference. The production years, the group of people that were out there were literally a family. You relied on them for your safety, and you were always there for their safety. It was just a bond. I always say it's similar to the military. You have that bond there. So yes, it was a risk we took on, but we had a lot of pride in what we did, and we knew what we were doing. And I had a sister that had a really hard time with me working out there because of the issues that we're in. But what we were doing was for the benefit of the country. And I know there is a lot of conflict and people think differently about it, but there was pride. So once that veil was left in '89, and even then it was hard because people tended to believe we were doing all these illegal operations. They tended to believe the worst. It was nice to be able to say this indeed didn't happen, or speak up and say, we did a good job, we did the best we could. We hadn't had a death out there with the operation. We had other deaths, but accidental, not to do with operations. But we were proud of what we did. We did a job and we did it safely, as safe as we could for the times. Now I can look back and some of the things that we used to do, I can't imagine that ever happening today. But that's just what happened in those days, just like when people used to dump waste in trenches. That wasn't that they were doing anything wrong, that's just what they did for that time. So I just look back now, and it was, you felt freer to discuss what you did, and you were able to take back your job, take pride in what you did. And in waste management, people always would say, why do you like being in waste? And I said, because I'm taking care of what's left behind now, and we're doing something with it.
Now, in our last talk, your last oral history, you talked about working with the pondcrete, and that you weren't too happy about that.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Did that have a real effect in terms of where you went from there?
Yes, because when I was only in that department for 4 months because of some of the things that were happening that I was not too happy with. And later it turned out a lot of the workers weren't aware of the hazards with the pondcrete, because it did have beryllium in it, and it had all the heavy metals, and it had all the volatile organics that settled to the bottom of the pond. They solidified it, and that's one of the things we got rated on. So what we did is I came in after they had processed all the pondcrete, and a lot of the pondcrete didn't solidify and harden up because of the concrete that was in the sludge. So we had to go in and take core samples. So if it was really dry, we were drilling without respirators. So you were breathing in all that stuff, and we weren't aware of the hazard. But I do know when we put on EPA codes, we put on almost every code that was out there. We put codes for cadmium, chromium, all the organics, and BE was one of the issues that I was concerned about. Because if it was dry concrete and we were testing it, we were drilling it, you were breathing it in. And I look back now, if it was wet sludge, if it was slimy, that stuff was getting absorbed into our skins. Luckily, I haven't had any problems, but we had a lot of concerns because we were back there. We had to the plastic, we'd have to rip open the plastic, and the water would come seeping out into the ground, and it was just hard. It was, as I said, I was out there when the FBI raided, and they came out and they brought their little boat, like I'd said, to go out into the ponds, and didn't stay there very long. I didn't feel comfortable with it, and safety issues at that time were a concern with me. So I figured it was just best, and that opportunity came up for me to go salary, so I took it. Best move I could have made, and to this day my husband jokes with me because I took a huge cut in pay.
Because you had seniority with the union.
Well, seniority not necessarily with the union, because you would always get paid the same, but because it was an entry-level position, it was a big cut in pay and no overtime. And one thing about Rocky Flats, if you're if you're hourly, you have a lot of overtime. But to me, it was just an opportunity. So that was one of the things I was not comfortable with, working out at the solar ponds.
Just to go back a little bit to describe what the solar ponds and the pondcrete was, can you describe how they were waste ponds?
They were waste ponds, right.
And that were then put into containers so that they could be stored, is that?
Right, they were waste ponds, and the sludge would settle out of the waste ponds, and also 374 had something that was called saltcrete, where they took their sludge from their processes and they solidified them with concrete, with cement basically. At the time they had a deadline that they had to meet, so rather than letting them sit and solidify, they were just processing everything through to try to meet the schedule, rather than trying to ensure that they were done right. What happened is they had processed so many, and there was no quality assurance on there, that a lot of them didn't set up hard. And they weighed anywhere between 2,200 to 2,700 pounds, huge blocks of concrete. And then they would wrap them in plastic, 2 layers of plastic, 6-inch tape. They'd sit them on pallets and they would set them outside. And they dewatered the ponds, the solar ponds, and that's where the sludge came. But when I went to go work out there, the ponds had already been dewatered. So what we were just doing was trying to go back and reprocess all the solar pond sludge and the saltcrete from 374 that hadn't hardened up. So we were taking that and they were trying to reprocess that to solidify it. So we literally, it was labor intensive because there were thousands of them. You would bring in so many every day on a flatbed truck. You would take them down, you would unwrap the plastic, and then you would have to see if they were hard. We had a instrument that you would actually puncture into it. If it was hard, it wouldn't puncture, so you would say, well, that's good, it would pass the test, and then you'd actually put them in packages, boxes, so they could be shipped off-site. And then if they were soft, they would go into another batch that showed that they weren't any good. Some of them were just so bad, they were so soft, when you would go to move them, they would just fall apart and rip open the bags that they were in. And I had said they were sit on asphalt pads. Asphalt pads had cracks in them. So that was a concern that we had, because you had contaminants potentially that were getting into the ground. But it was a long process. They removed the sludge and they ended up putting them in huge holding tanks on 750. But that was after I had left the solar ponds. And I think it was just 2 years ago when they finally brought someone in to treat the sludge in those holding tanks. And they got that off-site recently. But I wasn't part of that. So it was just a hard process. And the solar ponds now are cleaned up. They've been remediated and they backfilled them. I did have a concern about how they remediated them, because they left the liners in place. And I was hoping they would have taken them out. That way we would have really known that there was any additional contamination underneath. But only time will tell on that.
I presume they left the liners in place for cost saving.
Yes. And to me it would have behooved them, because the liners had cracks. That's one of the things that I did do. I didn't mention that. When I was out there, because I was there from April till August, I believe. It was very hot. We would literally take 1 gallon or 5 gallon cans of tar and go in and just pour tar into the cracks in the liners, the side of the liners where we didn't have water on them, because there were several cracks there. And when they did decide to close the ponds, that's one of the documents that working for Broomfield that we reviewed and commented on. I had preferred that they remove the liner because of the contamination. And even though they did sampling underneath, to me, at least if you would have removed it, that's removing an additional source and you would know what's directly under the liner. So we'll see what happens with that in years to come. But that's one thing that we'll need to watch out for.
Were you involved at all when you were working at Rocky Flats with any issues regarding the infamous 903 pad?
No, that was way before my time.
Okay.
When I was out there, it was barbed wired off and it was
Okay.
marked off, and you didn't get anywhere near it. As a matter of fact, all the years that I worked out there, we never knew the history of 903 pad. All that we knew, there was contamination. I'm speaking for myself and even my husband. We knew there was contamination and that it must have been really bad that they had to put a asphalt pad on it and barbed wired off so no one would go and have access to it. It goes back to more people on the outside knew a lot more than what we did about some of these things. So 903, I learned more about it in the job I have now than actually working out there. And even when they were remediating the trenches towards the end when I was leaving, I knew they were out there remediating something, but I didn't know what they were doing or why they were doing it. So it's interesting considering I was in the waste world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, what has it been like for you since you have left to kind of have a different perspective? You know, I mean, has it, first of all, has it presented any conflicts?
No, not really. To me, it's hard to put into words. When I worked out there, money was never an issue. And now when you're trying to say, okay, we would like you to do the right thing, it seems all of a sudden money is an issue. And I stand back and I say, well, the contamination is there for thousands of years, and the risk may not be as high, but there's still too many uncertainties and too many unknowns. And how are we going to address those? So when we were asking them to raise their standard a little, and if it's based on money, I sometimes have problems with that. Because I think in the spirit of cleanup of Rocky Flats for future generations, they should go that extra mile. And I know they're going to save millions of dollars by cutting corners. But I'm not a scientist. I'm only can provide technology stuff based on regulations and stuff. I can't foretell. When we first started talking about stewardship for Rocky Flats, it was hard to even imagine trying to control Rocky Flats 1,000 years from now, let alone 24,000 or 240,000 years. So it's easier for me now when I review documents to think in terms of even 50 years. And when I review documents now, that's what I actually do. I'll sit down and I'll think the process through from my experience with remediation in my previous job. Say, if this happens, what potentially could happen via erosion or something with the next 25 or 50 years? So that's how I go about looking at this and saying at least the controls are there short term. Long term, we don't know. When I talked to you last time, within this short time frame, things have changed so much as far as even technologies. Yeah. Working at Rocky Flats with the levels of contamination they had, when I first found out they were going to use a solution to bring down the contamination levels in the glove box, my first reaction is there's no way. It's impossible. It's too contaminated. And new technology has allowed it. So even in the last 2 years, they've had a lot of new technology. So I keep thinking, what are we going to know 20 years from now?
That's rather hopeful.
That is, oh, definitely. Because I know a lot of times I say, well, I want to make sure we have the best stewardship and controls in place now, because I tend to think people will forget. Right now, when you talk to people about Rocky Flats, they know that the plutonium buildings are going away and there's no risk, and it's going to be a beautiful, pristine refuge. And as long as people think that now and cleanup isn't done, 20 years from now, the way that we've had growth. I worked at Rocky Flats, and between '82 and now, look at the growth around Rocky Flats. So you can't tell me in 20 years you're not going to have someone somewhere saying we need to build on that land. And I know it's a refuge, and they said you're going to have an act of Congress to change it back, but that can happen. Yeah. That's my concern.
Is that your biggest worry?
That's my biggest worry. I would hate to see pressure put on them to actually go in and build on that land. It's a beautiful site, but there's still going to be residual contamination out there. And we don't have enough information dealing with risk. I'm not trying to use this as a scare tactic, but you can read all kinds of, the gamut's there from the extreme hazard from just one little minute amount to it's not a hazard at all. We don't have enough information to know that. And why take that chance? I think that's our responsibility, especially with the refuge. I understand we don't want to scare people off, but I think it's our responsibility to let people know this is out there.
How have you felt yourself with what you know about having this be a wildlife refuge?
I think I've made it real clear to most people. There's areas out of the over 6,000 acres, only around 500 or 600 are actually the industrial area where the buildings were. And that doesn't include the landfills, but for the actual buildings, I don't think they should ever have access there. And it isn't necessarily because of the risk, because of the surface we know. Right now, today, there will be no risk once it's cleaned. But again, back to 50 years from now, 25 years from now, we can have erosion. We're going to have the topography change. Do we want people out there not knowing what the risk is at that time? And I always tell people a story, and I think I said this in the last interview. When I first moved from Texas here, we lived in countryside, and when we bought our house, we had to sign a paper that said we lived by this production plant. And to this day, I always tell people that, because we were young, we were new to the area, and to be told a production plant, I just thought, oh, that's a law Colorado has. So not to have any signs in the future, even for people and new generations, to let them know this is what is underneath the ground. I think it's wrong if we don't remind people what's out there, or at least not necessarily remind them, but have some type of sign to ensure people aren't in that area. You can always have people wanting to dig, and even though the contamination is going to be deeper than a depth of 3 feet, by the time you have erosion come into play or people out there, in the industrial area is what I'm referring to, I don't think they should have access to it. The buffer zone, I feel people should have access. It's beautiful out there. It's a beautiful site for people just to go out there and to see the Lindsay Ranch. I'm not even, you can even from the overlook from the Lindsay Ranch look down. So it's all, you have the gamut. You have some people that don't want anyone out there at all because of the hazards, yet you want people that are just the opposite, that want every activity in the world out there. So I think you have to find a balance. Where you know there's not any contamination, it should be open to the public because there's such a shortage on open space.
Are there, in your work, you probably know about other areas, are there any models that you know of that, you know, of areas where they have done this and done it well?
I don't personally know of. I know of where they've tried doing it in the past. The institutional controls have failed, where they should not have had any groundwater drilling, and they've drilled for groundwater within 2 years after this has happened. Personally, the last job I had was site, uranium meal tailings. But we were cleaning up that site with
Was that in Grand Junction?
It was in Monticello, Utah, out of Grand Junction. It was interesting because when we were cleaning up that site, the person from the EPA wanted that to become a golf course. So we didn't have an end state, but you just look at, again, short term, if people know that there is no risk there, even though you are leaving some contamination behind, that knowledge is going to be gone in 20 years. So that's just my concern with Rocky Flats. It's beautiful. People should have access to enjoy it if they want. And I think it's their choice. But it should only be in areas where there's no residual contamination. Everyone, that's another, it's like a politics topic. Should you have the area fenced off? Should you not? I have people telling me, Shirley, we don't want signs at all because we don't want to scare people off. And I'm coming from, well, we don't want to scare them off. I just think we should at least let them be aware of where they are. That's why I think I was sad when the water tower went down, because to me that was a marker.
Yeah. Can you, this just happened, so could you go back a little bit?
Okay, the water tower, because of the height of the water tower, for miles you can see it almost anywhere. and I loved the water tower. It always reminded you of, from a distance, that's Rocky Flats. What had happened is, in the last 2 or 3 years, I kept hinting around to people I would love to keep the water tower there, not just for its historical value, because I know it's high maintenance. I don't know what the costs are to maintain it or to keep it painted, but just the fact that it would serve as a marker. So when you're on the site enjoying the refuge, that marker would tell you you're within the industrial area. It's letting you know. We just discussed this the other day, and they were saying, well, they would use GIS. So people, like the Fish and Wildlife, would have a GIS system, so where they stood, they would know where they're at. But to me, your population, your normal person is not going to go out there with a GIS system to know where they're at. I would like to have a fence around it or something so people would know, don't go beyond this. But again, there's all kinds of ways you can word it. You can say it's a science and technology area, or it's some type of area that's controlled that you want people to keep out of. And it doesn't have to be negative. So there's all different ways you can do. I am concerned when they say they want a seamless site, and eventually that the whole area will be open to the public. And that's just my concern. And other people, again, like I said, some people want to do everything there, horse trails, everything, and some people don't want anything there, and it comes back to a balance.
Now, in your work now with the city of Broomfield, do you get into these kinds of issues, or can you describe what your work?
We are getting into those issues, and what's really interesting is because when the Rocky Flats Coalition of Local Governments actually is working very closely with the refuge, we were trying to get the open space people from all the different governments together, because they know the open space issues and the ecosystems, and that's not my forte. I know very little. I know enough to be dangerous, because I've only had a few classes, so I can say, yeah, I know this, but what happened is we lost that balance because you had all these people that were your ecologists and stuff that wanted everything, and they weren't balancing the residual contamination. And you have to keep that in mind when you're identifying activities and controls. So what they did is each local government identified who the lead was going to be on it, and they would either work with the open space, or if the open space person was the lead, they would work with the Rocky Flats person for their government. And it turned out really good for us as far as Broomfield. Christine Pritz is the open space director, and I'm the lead on that. So we meet once in a while. We've only met like 3 or 4 times prior to meetings we've had with the service. And she'll say she'll like this, or I'll say, well, this is what I want. And we always end up understanding where each other is coming from. And I always bring her back to saying, these are the issues, and this is why we don't want this. Or right now, one of the problems we're having is trying to find conductivity trails and where the trails are going to go.
Can you explain a little bit what that means?
Conductivity trails are where you're going to connect, like the city and county of Broomfield to Rocky Flats, where Boulder will connect their trails to Rocky Flats, Jefferson County will. Ours is easy because we only have a limited amount of space north of Great Western Reservoir, up to our boundary line, across to Rocky Flats. What we were trying to do is keep away from the drainages, because we don't want people near the drainages. And we have a lot of monitoring wells, and it goes back to that's my concern with that balance. You don't want people breaking in or vandalizing the monitoring wells, because that's the only method that we have of knowing if there's contamination that's migrating. So it's nice to have people walk along the ravines and the drainages, but you also have to keep in mind this is where you're doing your major monitoring. You don't want people in those areas. Or I had made a comment that we necessarily were thinking about horses. We were not in favor of horses at the time, because we were concerned because of the waste they generate, and we have a nitrate problem, that we didn't necessarily want horses near the ravines getting into the water with their waste. And we had some horse groups that got very upset and made some calls to the city because they want horses out of the site. And they naturally interpreted that we didn't want any horses in Broomfield at all. So it took us 2 weeks to put that fire out and to say, no, that's not what we're saying. But so far, we said we would support having horses on the south side because Arvada wants them. And I think Jefferson County wanted them. And so our compromise was, well, you can have them on the south side, just keep them away from the north side where Walnut Creek is, because we don't want horses near the ravines and the drainages. So we'll see what happens. To me, it's going to be very interesting what they finally decide to do with the refuge. And Lindsay Ranch and the activities they're going to allow, and the revegetation. Burns is another issue. I'm not opposed to burning vegetation out there. My concern is the public process. And that's another hot topic. Some people are so afraid of burning. And no matter what the science and data you provide them with, it's not enough.
Do you think that's because of some of the things that happened years ago?
I think it's also perception, and I've learned too, sometimes you can try to provide data and information to people, but it's emotions, and it's not more than perception, it's their values and what they think. And you'll never change that. So with a refuge, that's why I always go back to that. If people assume they want to go out there, that's their decision. We're not forcing people to go out there, or vice versa. If they don't want to go, then that's fine too. So again, it goes back to that balance. But it's very hard with values and emotions to try to provide technical data, because for every paper you produce, someone else has written something that's just the opposite. So it's really hard when you're trying to come up with technical data. So that's one of the problems that we're having. But as far as what we're envisioning, we'll have to find out and see what the refuge ends up doing.
Now, you've been on the Citizens Advisory Board.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit about that, how you happened to get on it and what that's like for you?
This January will make 3 years that I've been on it. I really like being on it because now I'm not interacting as much with the local governments. I'm interacting more with people from all different organizations and just normal citizens to see what their needs are and what their wants are. Because it's easy for governments to know what they want for different things, but to actually talk to citizens and see what they want or what their concerns are is something else. I find that education it's key to everything, more than just values. You have to try to educate people. And I'm also a member of ComRad, and that's the Community Oversight Radiation Program. And what we do is, it's DOE funded also. They have some air monitoring stations in North Glen, Westminster, one in Broomfield in the parks. And they have air monitors that actually monitor for the plutonium, and they have weather stations. And the last 2 years we've done festivals, all like Broomfield Days or North Glen at the 4th of July. And we had the festivals, it's just an awareness of Rocky Flats. We're sponsored by DOE, we're a nonprofit, an education outreach, and plus we do this monitoring. And most people think Rocky Flats is done, or else they think Rocky Flats, they mix that up with the arsenal. So I step back and I'm thinking, okay, right now, if they're not educated on it, again, going back to the future, no one will remember that. One thing about CAB is, like I said, we have a good mix, and it's a balanced board. We had
the Citizens
Advisory Board. We had LeRoy, which was a great loss that we were talking about earlier, from Peace and Justice, Tom Marshall from Peace and Justice. Excellent people, and they brought balance to the board because of their values were really strong in what they wanted. They wanted to clean up the background. I was kind of like in the middle. I knew that would be too costly. To clean up the background, you spend most of your money on analytical sampling to send it to the lab to read such small levels. It could be done, but that's where most of your money would be spent. So you have to decide, you want all your money spent on analytical, doing less cleanup. And then we had people on the opposite of LeRoy who said, well, we don't want to spend the money, it's not a risk now, basically. So we had that balance. The thing I liked about Citizens Advisory Board, it runs off of consensus. When we provide recommendations to DOE, one person can stop our recommendation. So that's the good thing about it, because if you really have strong emotions or feelings about this, you represent the board, and you don't want a recommendation that goes out that doesn't represent your values or what you have to say about cleanup. So that's one of the things I think I'm right now a minority on, because we have a lot of new members, and they don't understand the purpose of having a consensus. They would tend to go more towards majority. But I think with consensus, it forces you to have that dialogue.
Now, how did that come about? Was that part of the structure that was built into the...
It was built in
whole
that way, and
idea?
that was way before me. It started in 1993, and as a matter of fact, my boss, Kathy Schnorr, was one of the original members of the Citizens Advisory Board. And the policies and bylaws were written very well with what they put in there has captured a lot of the things that are happening now. So they had a vision of what was going to be happening, a really unique vision. So it's been able to function. We've lost a lot of members in the past, I think because people are losing interest. And it goes back to the education again. We're losing a lot of the institutional knowledge right now, even at Rocky Flats, because people are leaving, the job's coming to an end. The regulators are leaving. And we just got 6 new members on the Citizens Advisory Board, because I'm on the membership committee, and 2 of them are, one's an assistant professor at CU, and another one's a professor, and they're interested in museums and maintaining the historical knowledge of Rocky Flats. And I'm trying to tell them that's wonderful because we have to preserve that so people will always remember what's out there. Everyone looks at the museum too for different reasons. You know, they want to keep the history because it's important and it's a story that needs to be told, and I understand that. That's good, and that's all well and good. But my primary purpose is to retain the institutional knowledge of what's out there so people don't forget about it. So that people don't start saying, well, let's develop, it's beautiful out there, we can build $1 million homes out there. And we don't want that to happen. So the board has functioned very well. Like I said, I'm excited about the 6 new members that we've gotten. But I think my time is just about over with the board because I think I've done what I can on that board, and it's time for me to move on and do some other things. And as far as the ComRad program,
Now, how long have you been with that?
since I started work, so it's a little over 3.5 years. It's so there's a group that's called the COP, the Citizen Oversight Panel, and it consists of a person from North Glen, Westminster, and Broomfield, and we oversee the program. And what we're doing now is we've drafted a lot of modules for grade school and junior high, dealing with radiation, things about Rocky Flats, the history of Rocky Flats, even we've brought weather into it because of the weather stations and how the air winds and the plumes migrate, so that they'll be aware of that. And it can be tailored to whatever module the teacher wants to use. What we plan on doing this year is hopefully developing the teacher's guides to go with these and just hand them out on CDs, whoever wants to do them. And that group also does, we do presentations. We've gone to the senior centers. I'm surprised the seniors are very interested in Rocky Flats because they tend to remember. They remember the fires or they remember the raids, and they always want to know about water issues. They ask really good questions. So I love going out there. We go to the Broomfield Senior Center and the Westminster Senior Center once a year. Then in the summer we do science fairs with the little kids at camps, and we go and we take our weather station out, and we also explain to them about Rocky Flats, because most of the younger children don't know anything about Rocky Flats. You can ask the little kids, and even back to Broomfield days or North Glen days, ask the children, and I'm talking maybe 9 or younger, if they've heard of Rocky Flats, and they'll say yes, and you say, well, what is Rocky Flats? And they'll say, well, it's a rock, or you know. So it's trying to get them to understand what Rocky Flats is. Again, it's not a scare thing, but this is what happened at Rocky Flats, and this is radiation. And we also teach them about natural radiation and put it into perspective. So it's very interesting. If you want, I can get you a CD of the modules. I'll let you know what we're working on. And what I think we're going to try to this next couple of years do a lot more education and outreach to the younger generations. So they'll continue to remember, yeah, I remember when I was little, someone came and talked to us about this thing called Rocky Flats. So that at least they'll know that there's something happened out there, there's something still there, so they'll remember it. So we're trying to, again, it's a balance again of doing that. So I figure with me leaving, hopefully, within the next 3 or 4 months, I probably will be leaving CAB, Citizen Advisory Board, and putting my efforts in some other things. I think with the museum doing what they're doing, and if I could gear something to get into the schools with younger children, programs that teachers can use. They can throw that in their science classes, their history classes, and again, it's for younger kids. And we're going to actually try to do some things for science fairs, for projects for the kids, and come up with stuff like that. So they'll always remember, if they go to the web page, we have a web page, they can look up Rocky Flats. So there's a lot of things always happening with Rocky Flats.
Yes, even though it's going on.
Yes, yes.
I wanted to get back to something, since you spent a lot of your work time in 771.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts about how it was then, how it is right at this moment, how it's going to be? Just could you talk a little bit?
Yes.
I know that in our last talk you did talk a little bit about what the building was like, but maybe you could talk more about it.
Again, like I said, 71 was one of the buildings. It was, as I said, it was the most dangerous building in the world at one time. But to work in that building almost was like a badge of honor for some people, because it was a very tight building. A lot of people didn't like working in it because it was an older building. And I joked, I think last time I had told you the story, when they first took me to look in one of the glove boxes there, I couldn't see in the window. It was all etched with acid and dark. And after a while, you got used to it. It was a very small building. You knew everyone that you worked with, the lines, the processing lines.
It's very small, really?
Well, for me, compared to 371 or some of the other buildings.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to know it. Basically, the processing rooms were two processing rooms, 114 and 149. Those were the two major rooms in 771 that you actually did processing in for glove boxes. So you either worked in one room or the other room, and there were what called slow lines or fast lines. The slow lines, the people could sit and read and do whatever they wanted, and then the fast lines, you were always busy trying to keep up with the lines, changing stuff. Those were the lines I preferred, because you always had something to do and something going on. And again, the infinity room was there. We didn't know that much about it. It was always cordoned off when I was there. We heard all kinds of rumors, all kinds of stories about the infinity room. Of course, you didn't know what to believe or what not to believe. But you would try to look into the room, and you couldn't even see the jackhammer that they always would talk about because it was dark in there. So when they actually started to decommission the infinity room, as a matter of fact, I was there a little over a year ago, went back into 71, and I was shocked. Because most of the rooms that I remember as rooms, the walls were gone. It was like a big open facility, like a skating ring almost. And we were actually able to look in the infinity room and look inside. Again, it goes back to something a year ago you would have asked me about, and I would have said, no way. There's no way they could have cleaned that up. The concern I do have is that room has still yet to come down, and they're going to tent it. And when they demolish it, the concern I have is additional air monitoring to ensure that nothing is released. So that's a bone of contention I have.
Yeah. Can you give a little bit of the history of the infinity room for those people?
The infinity room is a room that was so contaminated in 71. It held tanks, and what happened is the tanks continually leaked, and it got so contaminated. They actually had a jackhammer in there that they were trying to actually determine the levels of contamination, and they just left it there. They actually sealed up the room where no one can ever go into it anymore, ever again. And it had a little window, and I think it was either 8 by 8, something like that, that you can actually look into the room, but since it was so dark in the room, you really couldn't see anything in it. Curiosity always got you, because to go out to the dock, you'd always were passing by that room, but no one really paid attention to it because it was sealed off. So we always knew it was long before I had started out there.
Do you know when that was, like in the 60s or?
I can't tell you exactly. I should know that, but I don't. I do know too, and I was down there because we had a lot of men that were in the fire in the 60s and 71, and they were also helped put out the fire in building 776 in the 70s. So I could sit and listen to their stories about how they deconned for days and days and what little protection that they had. And the stories that they had were just so interesting then. And for what we were doing, they would always joke with us and say, oh, it's a piece of cake. This is nothing compared. And they'd always have their stories. This is nothing compared to what we did, and we would do this. And I'd always be there all shocked thinking, well, gosh. And again, 71 was as a building. Once in a while, the cafeterias would get contaminated because people would go out and the change would get contaminated in the vending machines, and they'd have to decon those. It didn't happen a lot, but it did happen. But again, it was more of a respect for, we knew what to do when contamination was released. So that was good. And if rooms ever got, as we say, crapped up, everyone just pitched in. You all would get dressed up and you'd all go in and you decon the rooms and take care of it, because everyone always helped each other. You very rarely had to ask anyone for help. Everyone just knew what to do. And that was a good thing about it. So when I went in last year with a lot of the rooms gone, I thought they would never get that building clean. Again, it goes back to the new technology that they have. Science has advanced so much.
So they really have been able to use very new techniques.
New techniques, that misting that they have some other cesium nitrate to bring down the radiation levels in tanks that I thought they would never be able to do, because we're talking infinity, where the levels were just so high. So when they talked about the infinity room, when we actually walked by and you could look inside and the people were in there, I was just in awe, because I never thought that would happen. And it did. So I give Kaiser Hill a lot of credit for going out and finding all these techniques and doing a lot of D&D and with what they're doing. I'm just surprised a lot of the other facilities. I understand they're coming to see what Rocky Flats is doing, but I'm surprised they haven't taken advantage of a lot of the techniques they've come up with. So the Infinity Room, I believe by March, that building will be gone.
The whole building?
The whole building will be gone.
Including
the Infinity Room. And they're supposed to put a tent around the room itself to contain it and have negative pressure on it to keep all the contamination inside as they bring that room down. My concern is, naturally, with air monitoring, the air monitors we have at the site are at the boundaries. And I always say that is the regulatory criteria, to have them at the boundaries. But I would feel more comfortable if they had what's called close-in air monitoring. That's closer, that gives you something that's more accurate. Again, I'm not an air person, so the site and I have had several discussions about that, and the state has been wonderful, CDPHE, at doing this additional air monitoring for us. And again, I tell them it's for me working for the city and county of Broomfield, it's an assurance to the citizens. We continually get calls from the citizens when they hear about something that happens out there. We're the ones that get the calls. And if I can truthfully say, I know this is what's being done, here's the additional precautions they're doing, I can explain that to them. So that helps me out a lot.
Just to go back a minute, when you said on the boundaries, as opposed to closer in to where the greatest contamination might be.
Right. Right. For closer in, I would say at least 300 feet away from where the actual building is coming down. That way you can actually get readings, closer in readings. Most of the air people will tell you, well, that's not good because it's too close. And I still say, well, at least we have something closer in that gives us more of a concentration that's accurate there at that point in time than by the time it gets diluted at the boundaries. So air monitoring for me has become a stickler of an issue because people don't tend to look at the air monitoring as much. And post-closure, a lot of people are already saying we won't need any because there won't be any contamination at the surface. But until you get vegetation in place and you have soil, we don't know what's happening. So even if we had 1 or 2 air monitors downwind, we'd be able to tell what's happening.
And do you think that will happen? I mean, do you think you...
Well, I've been pushing and pushing for it. I don't know. We'll have to see. I've talked to some of the regulators about it, and I think it's important near term. I think for you to be able to honestly talk to the citizens and build up that rapport and that trust with them, you have to go in and you have to have hard data. You have to go in and say, since we've closed and we've changed the topography and we know there's no more risk on the surface, at least 3 years or 10 years of air monitoring, we have data to show we've had nothing. Then you can say based on this evaluation. So I always tell DOE and Kaiser Hill, I'm not here to make you spend more money. I'm just trying to get sufficient data so that we can go back and reevaluate and make a determination there. I'm not wanting you to do something just to do it. And there's a lot of people that are that way because of emotions. I want you just to do it. I don't know why, but just do it. And I'm saying do it and get some data and then go back and reevaluate. Or else we can have data so when I get the calls, I can tell people, I have data right here, and look, we're so well below the standard, we've decided after so many years or whatever, we no longer need to continue doing it. Or maybe you'd go back once every 7 years or every 10 years and do a random sampling or something. There's all different solutions to this issue. So air monitoring, I think, will be an issue, though a lot of people think it's not.
The tape is running out.
Okay.
I'd like to change it.
Yeah.
Continuation of the second oral history with Shirley Garcia. You were just saying, as I was changing the tape, about what it's like to be saying goodbye to people, and
Yeah.
could you talk a little bit about what that?
Yeah, I was saying when I left, I was saying goodbye to all these people because I knew I was changing jobs and moving on because we're like a family. And now with less than 2 years left, basically, till the site is closed, people are leaving every week. So it's like saying goodbye all over again because people naturally are looking for other jobs or they're moving on. We have regulators that are moving on, just all your workers. So it's every day you hear if someone's gone and who you're going to be working with. And again, you're losing all that historical knowledge of this is what's happened, this is what we've been working on, and then you bring new people in. So it's really hard. So I think in 2 years, with the majority of the people gone, Kaiser Hill gone, who will we be working with? That's why, to me, it's really important that we have a presence of DOE out at the site that knows Rocky Flats, not someone from Grand Junction or some other place that isn't familiar with it.
Can you talk a little bit about DOE's role, well, maybe all the way through, because you have now a 21-year history.
Yeah. Well, when I first was out there, DOE was out there, but we never interfaced with them. When
There
I
were
was
just a few regulators, right?
well, there weren't even regulators. When I was out there, that was even before that. You know, when I was out there, we didn't even know who the DOE site manager was, because we never interfaced with them. And it wasn't until after the raid from the FBI that we learned of some of the names of DOE, or when we were in trouble, you knew of DOE. And that has changed considerably. It's different. When I came back working for Broomfield, I was surprised how much DOE was involved with the subcontractor, which is Kaiser Hill now. And even now, every meeting that I attend, DOE is there. So they're really involved. The thing is, DOE had a huge staff, and they've already identified the last, I believe it's at 24, 25, that are going to be staying till closure. And everyone else will be gone. So they have an investment. Kaiser Hill is there. And as soon as Kaiser Hill is finished with the remediation, they're gone, and it's going to be left up to DOE to finish the closure of the site, to delist it off the CERCLA NPL site listing. So they will be there, but my concern is we need someone there that knows the site that can say, yeah, if we have a problem, I remember this happened, or I'm aware of this. That process knowledge is just crucial. Kaiser Hill's going to be gone. Stewardship is not in their contract. They're there to get their job done, and that's better for them. They're there to do what they need to do. To me, it's DOE that's responsible, and they should ultimately always be responsible. The mining issue is another issue too, for the refuge. But it's funny though, because I look back now. But even now, I can go out to some of the people that I used to work with, and I'll say, "Oh, I just had a meeting with so and so," and I'll mention some of the people from DOE, and they still don't know. So it's, again, being on the outside versus being on the inside, because they don't interface with DOE as much. So it's a different situation. Same thing with the regulators. I only got to know the regulators because of my work in waste. After the FBI came out, even prior to that, we would work with them on inspections when they would walk down. And just before I left, we were intimately always involved with the regulators because they were out there all the time. They had an office out there. So now I work with them just as much, and now they have a lot more regulators out there. So we'll see what happens with them. And we just lost Steve Tarleton. He took another job, and he was a big asset as far as working out there, overseeing the cleanup and demolition. And so,
what has your, now I know I've talked with some of the old-time workers that think, you know, everything has just become so complex, all this paperwork, all these regulators. But what is your perspective on that? I mean, you've been there a long time, but you also have perhaps a different perspective.
Well, even when I was out there when the regulations came into being, we had drafted a lot of the original things. The old timers are used to doing stuff their way and don't understand the regulations. So them it was something that was just additional mandate on them.
Right.
But they didn't understand why they were doing what they were doing. Even in my last job, we had people working with the meal tailings, and it was even worse because there you're not really worried. The job I had, we weren't worried about packaging waste. We had a cell on site. We were just getting the dirt, putting it in dump trucks, and moving it to the cell. And the paperwork that was involved because of the regulations, they just could not understand. And it's hard to fight the old mentality. We've done it this way for years. Why are we doing it this way now? It doesn't make sense. And trying to explain to them. And I found this, you don't tell them that's just the way it is. You know, I don't like it, but that's just the way it is. You try to tell them, well, look, it says we need to do this because of this. Does that help you out? And it's either yeah, or no, or they'll kind of, but eventually they'll end up doing it. But when RCRA first came out there, it was hard for a lot of people to get used to it.
Can you explain what RCRA means?
It's the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and that's basically for hazardous waste constituents. Your organics, your heavy metals, there's a certain list that identifies them in the laws. And we fell under that, like I said previously, because of a lawsuit. And what had happened is no one really knew too much about it. So back in the old days, and I look back now and I say, I don't know how we even did it. People would generate waste, then it would go to the drum counters. That's where I used to work in NDA. Then after we counted it, whether it would, because of the weight or the activity, it would be either true waste or low-level waste. And once we counted it, then we would stick a hazardous waste label on it. Not understanding why, we just knew we had to have a hazardous waste label on it. But back in those days, to me, hazardous waste wasn't a defined list that I know of now. I thought it was asbestos. Anything in the world that was hazardous or toxic to me was a hazardous waste, and that is not the case. And that's one of the problems right now, even with the Citizens Advisory Board, because they're still thinking anything that's hazardous to me or toxic to me is a hazardous waste. So it's hard to break up the different regulations and say, no, they need to do this based on this because of this, and it doesn't include this constituent. So we had a hard time doing that, and we would just stick hazardous waste labels on, not knowing why, but that was our new procedure. And then later we found out what we were doing wasn't necessarily the right thing. It was the generator that generates the waste, that knows what's in the waste, that had to put the label on. And it took us a while to get there. I mean, a lot of training, extensive training, but you just can't train the whole population about RCRA. It's not something that's not that easy to understand. It's not that hard, don't get me wrong, but some people are either interested in it or they're not. So I just loved dealing with that. I loved reading the regs, so I thought it was real exciting. And when I go back to the site, I still get excited because I see a lot of people in waste that are still in waste. And they love what they're doing. And I saw a guy yesterday, as a matter of fact, and he said he was overseeing asbestos abatement. I believe it was in 707 or 776. So they stayed in their same world, which was interesting.
What do you think led you into the love of waste? Of course, you had so much real hands-on experience. Do you think that had something to do with it?
I think so too, but I tell everyone, not just me because I love it, I think anyone that finds a profession that they really like, and I taught part-time at Parks College, and people would always come up to, my students would come up to me, no matter what their age, and say, what do I do? And I said, I can't tell you what to do, only you know what you like. But it's hard to tell someone, you know. I said, but once you find out what you want to do, it's just going to click. Right then and there, that moment, you're going to know this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And everyone has a different passion for different things. I could never be a bookkeeper, but some people love numbers. I think it's all what everyone likes. And I just knew, even back then, I always loved moving drums, dealing with waste rather than the production side. Why, I don't know.
So there was a difference to you in dealing with waste versus the production.
And most people didn't like dealing with waste because it was cumbersome, it was physical. You were moving drums, you were moving crates, you were always moving things around, whereas In the production, you're actually in the glove boxes, and it's just different work. So I always liked doing that. And in NDA, you also could count the material in small containers. But I really never liked that. I liked doing the stuff where we had the paperwork and we had procedures that we had to follow. I liked structure. I think that's why I liked it a lot. So that was the fun part for me. And even when I went to Monticello, even being a compliance person, I still loved that because we were still dealing with moving the mill tailings to the sale and the paperwork and dealing with water issues and stuff like that.
Now, when you made that shift from Rocky Flats to Grand Junction, to Monticello, was that because you needed a change then, or were you doing that? You were doing that partly because Rocky Flats was going to
Well,
go.
I knew Rocky Flats was going to go, but I had been working really long hours. Again, I loved what I did, but it got to a point where I was very fortunate when I was out there. I always had the other companies that would come and say, well, because we would always characterize waste or go in and take care of excess chemicals. And they would actually say, we'll give you a charge number, just bring your people in and come do this for us. But it got to a point where there was just so much work, and it was very hard to find qualified people. It's hard to explain when I tell people it's almost like a little, it's something specific and unique that people can do as far as characterizing and interpreting analytical data. Not everyone in the world does it, and you have to be detailed oriented, and I've always loved details. It was very hard for me at the end because I even brought in a lot of people that I had subcontracted to bring in because we couldn't find enough qualified people, and it was just very hard. I was spending like 60 hours a week, bringing work home, trying to keep up with stuff. So when I got this call, I thought that was a perfect opportunity. And I learned a lot when I was in Monticello. It just, I'm always learning. That's why I say 2 years from now, if I'm talking to you, I'm going to say, why did I say those things, you know? I've learned so much more. And I can say that even about the letters I write to DOE. Last year's letter, I've learned a lot since last year. But I've learned a lot. Every time I turn around, something has changed, something new has changed, our focus, or we're always learning stuff. That's why I'm really excited when we actually do clean up the site. And even 2 years from now, when we're doing the final record of decision to close the site, the advancements we're going to have. But again, it's that vision, writing the policies and the procedures for years to come, and hopefully trying to say you're not going to miss anything, any potentially contingency that comes up.
Let's see. Is there anything that we haven't touched on in these couple of times? Any of your experiences at Rocky Flats, or things that we just somehow haven't gotten to?
Well, I tell you, we always had a lot of fun when I was out there. As serious as the work was, you had to make it fun, so you wouldn't concentrate on the seriousness, or not necessarily the risk, but you knew what you were doing. You had to concentrate on what you were doing. So you always had to have fun. You always had to laugh. I tell you, even in the halls, we'd be dancing down the halls, or someone was always doing something. There was always a jokester. You had to always keep laughing. We'd have chair races sometimes, you know, but again, we had foremen that were part of the group with us. We had excellent Jack Weaver. We had some really excellent building managers that really cared about their people, that were sincere. They were back in the areas with us all the time. And when EG&G came in, it was a totally different world, because the majority of them were Navy nuke. And I'm not stereotyping, don't get me wrong. It was just a different environment, from Rockwell to everything you could do was okay. There was endless amount of funding. EG&G came in, they were more serious, naturally, because of the raid. And I always tell people that I remember they came in and said, nothing will be done unless you have a procedure. And I think I said this in my last interview, that everything shut down, because there really was no procedure. And that kind of worries me sometimes too, when they say they're going to build a new Rocky Flats, because we had procedures, but we never had procedures that you followed, because they never worked. You always knew how to run a process because the person before you showed you how to run that process. And you were always altering what you were doing to meet the needs of the process. So they're going to build a new Rocky Flats. it'll be interesting to see if they'll be able to follow procedures instead of tweaking the system as you need to. Because a lot of the systems aren't just systems that run like normal production systems to meet the needs, because whatever you're feeding into the system can be a little bit different. So you are always tweaking the system. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens, wherever that ends up going. But we were always doing that, though.
Do you think there will be another Rocky Flats, another place where they will make?
Well, I know they're looking at it now, and I'm sure they will. Because right now, as sad as it is, people say we don't need bombs anymore. Most of the weapons that we have now had to be brought in soon to be reprocessed, and we're going to be very vulnerable. I think now, if they do build a new Rocky Flats, they're going to be smarter how they build it. And even if they're smarter now, though, it goes back to 50 years from now, what they do now still won't be sufficient. I believe I went to, I think it was Oak Ridge, whatever one of the sites was that has the PCB building. They built that building with the intent that it was going to be demolitioned. And I love that idea because they knew they were building it knowing they were going to have to take it down. So at least that's a step ahead. We'll see what happens with this new Rocky Flats or where it goes.
You were mentioning a little while ago about working with people like LeRoy Moore
Mm-hmm.
and Tom Marshall. And I wondered how it was when you were working at Rocky Flats and how you felt about protesters and people like them. Did your feelings change?
Yes, because when the protesters were out there, I felt how dumb they were. This was me thinking. They didn't realize what was happening, and to me it was like being disrespectful for the country. We're here trying to protect our country and do something for the country. And the same old saying, if it wouldn't have been for us, they wouldn't be out there protesting. You know, the dynamics of that, the same stuff that people always say. But after I met LeRoy and Tom Marshall, again, I have such respect for them. LeRoy, to me, is a person of peace. He truly is. And it's not just his values. He is that person, and that's why he was protesting. He wants peace. And that's a statement that never came across us as the workers as clear. It was, when I was there, it was these fools are out there because they don't want Rocky Flats here. They prefer it go someplace else. But if it wouldn't have been for us, they wouldn't be protesting. But now, when I actually see what they were doing, it wasn't for Rocky Flats. They wanted peace for the world, which everyone wants. It's how we go about peace is what people don't agree on. That's the issue. But what he does, he's wonderful, and it's not just Rocky Flats. He always has high values for everything for his human being. The stuff that he does. Same thing with Tom Marshall. They've always been very respectful. And they're just telling people this is what we feel and this is why we feel this. It's a shame, though, that that never really happened when I was out there with the protesters, that no one actually sat down to say, where are you coming from, and this is where we're coming from. So I look back now and I said, of course, back then we knew, again, you couldn't talk about that stuff. So it left us at a disadvantage. And now I look back and say, what he did, he should be honored for what he did. Because he was speaking up, and that's why we're fighting. Even in Iraq, we're fighting so we have that freedom to voice our opinion. Same thing with Tom. Tom's supposed to go on to law school, I heard, and I haven't talked to him since he's left, but he'd be excellent at that. The same thing with DOE. We've had some really good people. I respect them also for what they've done. I think we're all trying. It's how we get there is what we don't agree on sometimes, and trying to come up with a compromise. And again, my concern is, I keep saying this, 50 years from now, if anything happens before 50 years, who ultimately is going to be responsible? What are the plans? Because I'm so detailed oriented. What will be the process? And that's what my concern is right now. So I could at least have some confidence that if something does happen, that there will be funding to initiate a contingency, or if something happens, if they have to go back and dig up some more soil, there'll be funding for that. So we're not.
You're saying if something happens, if something happens at the site.
Again, it goes back to erosion, or if we see that we have elevated levels in the surface water, it means we have a source that's being released. And what are your plans to do that? That's all I've been asking DOE. They need to start thinking about that now, because if 2 years goes by fast, they want to be done by 2005. And I can easily see them doing it because everything is coming down really, real fast. But they need to start thinking with a vision towards the future instead of concentrating on everything now that's happening. So that's what I say. I tend to look at, when I read the documents, that's what I actually do. I'm not looking at what they're doing necessarily now, but what the impact is short term. And they need to start having those discussions. It'll be interesting to see what happens once they're gone. How I think a study should be done on the citizens themselves. I would love to see 10 years after the site is closed, if any citizen has any concern. And it goes back to education, outreach. I'm willing to bet if there is no funding for education and outreach, most citizens will say there is no issue. And if there is no issue and you don't have your politicians, will there be funding to continue monitoring? So I don't know, I would like to see different studies. And again, it goes back to funding. Even 10 or 15 years after the site is closed. A simple little survey to see what people know or what they remember and see how it's captured. And
maybe you will be one of the people that will be doing that.
well, no, luckily I could say my job when I was hired was not specifically for Rocky Flats. So that's good, I'll still be around, but it'll be interesting how they disseminate information post-closure. I don't think citizens, and this is from me interfacing with a little that I've interfaced with the Broomfield residents, and even my neighbors that come around here too, they don't want the specific data. They just want someone that they can trust to pick up the phone and call and say, am I safe? I heard this is being done, can you give me a little more information? So again, it's trying to find that balance, because I talked to John Rampey from DOE. I say, from Broomfield's point of view, we want the data. We want it quarterly for the surface water, because we actually sample in addition to them. So we can actually, we're reviewing it and evaluating it also at the same time. I don't think the normal citizen wants to do that. I don't think they can. What I would, and I've talked to Rampey about this, I think they should send out an annual report, or whoever wants to have access to it, in layman's terms. We haven't had any problems with surface water, or whatever it is that they're monitoring for, and do a short, whatever it is that they do, a paper or something to give to the general public that wants to be on a list. And I think that would suffice. But there's also a higher level of need, which is from like Broomfield or even Westminster with their water issues, or your small population of people that are really interested, that should have the data to evaluate and go out with them when they do inspections or whatever they want to do. They want to be more involved. And to me, that's another method of continuing what they do to pass on that to someone else. So you still get that information out both ways. I hope that happens. I don't know if it will happen because of funding again. But to me, I think that's the best way to do it. So I've been pushing for that. We'll see, though. 'Cause people are too busy nowadays. They don't want to read 20, 30 pages of anything. They want a nice, short summary in terms that they can understand. And especially with the refuge going out there, it'll be interesting to see how that ends up.
Of course, with the refuge, that will be a place that can keep the interest going.
It'll keep the interest going, but if you don't have the Fish and Wildlife Service out there on a daily basis, you're just going to have people out there, and they won't be thinking of it as Rocky Flats, the plutonium facility. They'll be thinking of it as Rocky Flats, the refuge. Because it is beautiful, like I said. And you go out there, you're just in awe because it's so beautiful. You don't think of anything else. And we'll have our landfills out there that still will have waste in them. So those, we don't want people to forget about that. Yeah. You look at now how many houses are built on solid waste landfills.
Was there anything else you can think of that you'd like to speak about?
No, just that, like I say, every now and then, like I had mentioned to you earlier, have a lot of friends out there that have passed on. And so I'll run into someone and we'll be talking about someone, and you just know so many people, you forget about them until they mention their name. And it's that time. That's why I said it's really important that these interviews are being made. And I had just hoped that they had done, like we were talking about earlier, gone through all the buildings and videotaped all the rooms before they went in and started decommissioning. Just the thought of some of these buildings, what they looked at. It's hard for me to describe 71. As dark as it was, the glove boxes, yet we were used to it. But when you go in there as an outsider, it was totally different. You couldn't see anything. And 371 was just the opposite, this nice, big, bright, clean building. So it was different. And people, to me, 71, people would always, the nickname for it was the dungeon because of the fact that it was so dark. But again, like I said, it was to work there. You either liked working there or you hated it. Some people wouldn't get caught dead there because they were afraid that they were going to get contaminated, because you had a much higher risk there because of the liquids in the building. And I don't know if I told you last time, they had a friend, they had a can of oxide that the lid had come off, and it's so light it had contaminated one of the rooms real, real bad. I don't know how many months it took them to do that. And I was in 371 when that happened, and I had volunteered to go down to help them. And again, it goes back to you want to be with your friends and help them as much as you can. And that's still the case now, even though a lot of them no longer work there. If they know if someone's in need, they'll call you, or all you have to do is pick up the phone and call them, and they'll let you know. So it'll be interesting with this new set of people that I've been talking about, not the Flats people, but the Rocky people. When the site is closed, the rapport that we're going to have. And still, a lot of them are a lot younger, so I know they're going to move on probably to other sites or other jobs. It'll be just interesting to see where all these people end up. And the museum is another thing I'm excited about, to see what goes into that, how it's going to be finalized. It'll be interesting to see. Again, to me, there's can be used for science and technology to get funding, all kinds of stuff, educational outreach stuff, and that's the key. Those are the ones you have to reach, are the school children. You have to, so they won't forget. Or if not, they'll be saying, well, there never was a problem. There was never at Rocky Flats.
They're going to say, Rocky? Rocky what?
What? Yeah. Like the little kids say, it's a rock. And I love it when we do the festivals. I'm surprised at some of the answers that we get from some of the people about Rocky Flats. Or they think it's, like I said, you can talk to people now and they say, yeah, we know it's cleaned up and it's gone. And you're trying to tell them, no, it's still being cleaned up. But I think because they know it's no longer, the fear is gone. So it's not on their radar anymore, like some of the other issues. I deal with everything, so it used to be when I first started, I was getting quite a few calls about Rocky Flats. Now the majority of my calls are about mosquitoes. So you're always keeping up with what the citizens feel is their highest risk. So that's why I think it's so important. But and again, back to the tower, that's gone. And I went out there yesterday, and most of Main Street on Central, most of those buildings are gone. And it's just changing. All those main buildings will be gone.
Well, maybe we should stop.
Okay.